you know, and it's obviously, it's an incredibly beautiful, deeply thoughtful book. And I was pleased to say yes when Matt asked me to do this thing. So just the sketch, the outlines. Paul was born in 1977. He was raised in a Christian family, immigrants from southern India. He came by his interest in medicine, honestly, because his father was a physician. He grew up, you know, in the Northeast originally, but spent most of his youth in Kingman, Arizona, you know, out in the desert wastes of Arizona. His father was the practicing cardiologist there. He, as he says, was ejected like an electron from the orbit of Kingman and wound up at Stanford as an undergrad. Graduated in 2000. He had a double major, BA and MA in English literature, of all things, and then a bachelor's in human biology. And he found himself, you know, pulled between these two poles of English literature and the kind of wisdom he found there and biology. He went and did a master's degree in the history and philosophy of medicine at Cambridge, came back to Yale for his MD, where he got his MD in 2007. And there's where he met Lucy Goddard, who was also a Yale MD and is currently a Stanford faculty member. And they were married and made the trek westward to do residency at Stanford. That was like coming home to Paul in a sense. He was a neurosurgery resident at Stanford. For those who don't know, neurosurgery is perhaps the most intensive residency that's possible. It takes 7 years to get through a residency. That's after your MD. And he had sort of reached the pinnacle of that and was the next graduating class from the residency when he was diagnosed in 2013 with stage 4 lung cancer. And the book is really about his coming to the decision to do neurosurgery, the impact of the diagnosis, and the search for value and meaning after the diagnosis and the life decisions to be made. He died in 2015. His wife, Lucy, is still an internist at Stanford, and she wrote the beautiful epilogue to When Breath Becomes Air. So all of the influences in Paul's educational background are evident in this beautiful book. The medicine, obviously, but also the deep knowledge and engagement with English literature, but also his Christian background, because he's easily familiar with the idiom of the Bible and of Christian faith and makes allusions throughout the book to biblical stories. And many of the themes in the book are very religious. So, you know, he's obviously a masterful writer. I mean, you can open that book up at any page at random and just drop into it and be swept away with his eloquence. And he's obviously a dedicated physician. And I have two personal anecdotes about Paul. One of them I'll start with right now. The second one, we probably won't have time to get to it, but I'll get to it when I can. And I was co-teaching a course back in, I don't remember when it was while Paul was in his residency. So it was after 2007. And Paul was one of the lecturers as a neurosurgery resident that we asked to come in and speak in the course. This course is called Social and Ethical Dimensions of Neuroscience, or Social and Ethical Issues in Neuroscience. And I was one of the co-instructors, and we had a series of guest lecturers in there. And so kind of the theme that we were developing in the course was, what does it mean to be human? And that's a very academic thing, right? That academics can sit around and kind of shoot the breeze about all evening long with a lot of pompous opining. And Paul came in and just cut through the BS immediately. And he talked to the students about, you know, this being an abstract question, what does it mean to be human? But that it was very concrete when you were in neurosurgery, when you were a neurosurgeon, and you were in the operating room about to take out a piece of somebody's brain because of a tumor. And that piece of the brain you're considering taking out has certain functions. And you have to ask yourself, is it better for this person to wake up and be paralyzed on one side of their body, or better for this person to die more quickly of cancer? You know, is it better for this person to wake up mute and not be able to speak and have 4 months more of life, or to be fully speaking for the rest of their natural life. And, you know, that in that sense, this question of what it means to be human becomes extraordinarily concrete. And, you know, when he would describe this to the students, you could hear a pin drop in the room. So, you know, it was really remarkable. And that kind of issue, what does it mean to be human? That's really what drew Paul into neurosurgery to begin with. It was not primarily a career for him. It wasn't primarily a job for him, and not even a vocation. I would say it was almost an obsession for him to help people in the very direst of circumstances and to test his own talents, to push his endurance, his skills to the very limit in neurosurgery, and to come to grips with death at very close quarters. It was almost an obsession for him, even more than it was a vocation or a career or job. That was really remarkable. So the book kind of starts off, and I'll pick up here, and I'll go over to the PowerPoint presentation, and I need to share my screen somehow or another.
Down on the bottom, there's a green share screen.
Yeah, you want to share it first and then
Here, share screen.
do that, and then choose the one with Paul's picture. You have to choose that. Yeah. And
I
then
have
hit share.
my technical consultant here with me.
All right, and now now that's being shared, so now you can hit that and it'll go to full screen.
Okay, do all of you see this?
That's perfect.
Okay, all right, so here we go. So that's Paul, you know, at the peak of his powers as neurosurgery resident. And this obsession that he had with the brain and the mind and the soul comes out in some of the quotes from the early parts of the book. And this presentation here is going to be a series of quotes in kind of 3 stages. So this is the early stage. I had started this career in part to pursue death, to grasp it, uncloak it, and see it eye to eye, unblinking. Neurosurgery attracted me as much for its intertwining of brain and consciousness as for its intertwining of life and death. So, you know, Paul's sitting here saying, this is not, I'm not really pursuing life, I'm pursuing death, right? Which is a very odd way for a physician to present things. And he continues later, a few pages later, getting far away from petty materialism, from self-important trivia, getting right there, those italics are in the book, getting right there to the heart of the matter, to truly life and death decisions and struggles. Surely a kind of transcendence would be found there. But there's the English literature guy for you know, searching for transcendence, right? And this, as a medical resident, my highest ideal was not saving lives. Everyone dies eventually, but guiding a patient or family to an understanding of illness or death. That I found that just a very unique perspective on what it means to be a physician. And then he tacks on this coda a little later that I'm sure you'll appreciate, Matt. He says, had I been more religious in my youth, I might have become a pastor, for it was the pastoral role I had sought. So, you know, he was a surgeon of the very highest order, but he's really saying his primary role is to guide a patient or family to an understanding of illness or death, which is a very pastoral role. Yeah. And that's the one he sought. So he goes on, I mean, just eloquent as ever. I don't think I ever spent a minute of any day wondering why I did this work or whether it was worth it. The call to protect life, and not merely life, but another's identity. It is perhaps not too much to say another's soul was obvious in sacredness. So he's back to sacredness here, and he's back to this deep intertwining of brain and mind, or as he says, perhaps not too much to say soul. Before operating on a patient's brain, I realized I must first fully understand his mind, his identity, his values, what makes life worth living, and what devastation makes it reasonable to let that life end. You know, so this is kind of the antithesis of your stereotypical surgeon who just likes to cut, right? Surgeons like to surge, they like to cut stuff. And this is kind of the antithesis of that, who says, before operating on the brain, I must first fully understand the mind.
My brother-in-law is an ER physician, and he said surgeons prefer their patients unconscious.
Yeah, not
That's
Paul.
Right. Not Paul.
No,
not Paul. So he says, the cost of my dedication to succeed was high, and the ineluctable failures brought me nearly unbearable guilt. Those burdens are what makes medicine holy, with an H, and wholly impossible, with a WH. In taking up another's cross, one must sometimes get crushed by the weight.
It's remarkable.
So Matt, I imagine you know from personal experience what that means. All of us probably are old enough to know from personal experience to some extent what that means, but especially in your profession, and Catherine, in yours.
Yeah.
So this was kind of the foreshadowing, right? This is Paul in his lead up to becoming a full-fledged neurosurgeon, an academic faculty member somewhere. And, I knew him at this time, and, just the easy confidence that he carried himself with. But then he got this diagnosis of stage 4 metastatic lung cancer. It's a diagnosis he should have gotten earlier, and he probably, through some subliminal process, delayed actually getting to the doctor and getting a definitive diagnosis. But he gets this diagnosis, and this is the pivot point of the book. This is the diagnosis where everything had been potential and working for potential, and now he's just devastated with no real hope. So this is kind of the low point, really. My life had been building potential that would now go unrealized. I had planned to do so much, and I had come so close. I was physically debilitated. My imagined future and my personal identity collapsed, and I felt the same existential quandaries my patients faced. So here's the role reversal. Death, so familiar to me in my work, was now paying a personal visit. Here we were, finally face to face, and yet nothing about it seemed recognizable. Standing at the crossroads where I should have been able to see and follow the footsteps of the countless patients I had treated over the years, I saw instead only a blank, a harsh, vacant, gleaming white desert, as if a sandstorm had erased all trace of familiarity. So I think this is really the low point. It's not death that's low point, it's the absence of hope that's the low point. And realizing that you've been here so many times with so many patients, and that knowledge is
Not useful.
not useful to you in the moment. And this goes back, if you guys want to discuss this later, about theories of human consciousness and experience, the so-called hard problem of consciousness and the easy problem. Bree's telling me to get on with it. Don't get sidetracked.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we can talk about that. But following the diagnosis, and he knows this all perfectly well, right? He can read the X-rays. He's done it so many times, and he knows instantly what's going on. And he recovered from this devastation remarkably well with the assistance of a lot of people, but particularly 2 women. Emma, who was his oncologist. I don't know if that's actually a real name or a fake name. It might be a fake name. And his wife, Lucy, that's not a fake name. And those 2 women played a pivotal part in his recovery from the abyss that we see in these 2 quotes in front of us right here. So, he as a doctor wants to know the odds, he's calculating them. Emma is directing him to other ways of thinking, the same way that he's directed other patients before. He says 2 months in, Emma remained vague about any prognostication, and every statistic I cited, she rebuffed with a gentle reminder to focus on my values. And this is a quote from Emma. Let me ask this: is surgery important to you? Is it something you want to do? So this is a surgeon, focusing on values, right? Which is pretty remarkable and pretty incredible. Flush in the face of mortality, he says, many decisions became compressed, urgent, and unreceded. They could not be put off. Foremost among them was, should Lucy and I have a child? So before the chemotherapy and all the chemicals and poisons, they had frozen some of his sperm because they knew this was on the table. It had been something we always wanted, and we were both impelled by the instinct to do it still, to add another chair to our family's table. That's a very beautiful phrase right there. So that was the first decision they faced. And the second one is whether to go back and continue his residency training. That morning, I made a decision. I would push myself to return to the OR. Why? Because that's who I was. Because I would have to learn a different way of living. Knowing that even if I'm dying until I actually die, I'm still living. I can almost hear Emma's voice again. You have to figure out what is most important to you. And I think that's where a lot of Lenten themes really start coming in here. And for all of us, you know, until I actually die, I'm still living, and you have to figure out what is most important to you. And that's one of the greatest themes of the book. So there's a little coda here, and I couldn't resist picking up on this. I mean, you guys, you read the book, you saw the biblical references throughout the book. And he talks about sort of an at least equivocal return to Christianity. He talks about it in terms of values. When he starts talking about God, he gets a lot more vague. But he says, yet I return to the central values of Christianity: sacrifice, redemption, forgiveness. And those might be three things that we want to come back to in the discussion, sort of Lenten themes of sacrifice, redemption, forgiveness. See, blending over into Easter, right? Because I found them so compelling. The main message of Jesus, I believed, is that mercy trumps justice every time. So that theme, that mercy trumps justice every time, is one we're very familiar with at St. Mark's because of Matt's preaching. You know, Matt says, like, I can't remember how many times since Bree and I have been going to the church, it's all about love, you know, and I think the subtext here is that mercy trumps justice. So I picked this selection out. This, for anyone who read the book, this might not be one that you'd remember or pick out, but I was really captivated by this because he's talking theologically here, and he's talking about the unknowableness of God, and talking about, you know, in the end, what is truth with a capital T? And I thought this was just a very poignant kind of phrase, passage here. In the end, it cannot be doubted that each of us can see only a part of the picture. The doctor sees one, the patient another, the engineer a third, the economist a fourth, the pearl diver a fifth, the alcoholic a sixth, the cable guy a seventh, the sheep farmer an eighth, the Indian beggar a ninth, the pastor a 10th. Human knowledge is never contained in one person. It grows from the relationships we create between each other and the world, and still is never complete. And truth comes somewhere above all of them. So I was so struck by this because who would assemble those 10 people in one sentence?
Oh.
Paul Kalanithi.
Paul Kalanithi.
He would, apparently. Yeah. You know, you go from a doctor to an alcoholic to an Indian beggar to a sheep farmer, engineer, pastor, and human knowledge is never contained in one person. And who among us can argue with that, right? And truth comes somewhere above them all. So I'll kind of, the last thing from the book that I'll put in front of you to kind of think about and feel about is probably the most famous passage from the book. This is the last paragraph in the book, actually, where Paul is, you know, thinking and feeling about the birth of his daughter, Katie, who was born about 6 months, I think, before Paul died.
Okay.
8 months before Paul died. And he was thinking about writing letters to his daughter. And, you know, I'm 67, I have a 4-year-old, and I've thought about writing letters to my daughter, but I thought the same way he did, that who knows what this young person will be like at age 15 or age 20 or whatever. How would you even know what to write? And so, you know, this is the paragraph you see quoted over and over again, but I think it's one worth us looking at. There is perhaps only one thing to say to this infant who is all future, overlapping briefly with me. That message is simple. It's not so simple. He says it's simple, but it's not so simple. When you come to one of the many moments in life where you must give an account of yourself, provide a ledger of what you have been and done and meant to the world, do not, I pray,
discount that you fill the dying man's days with a sated joy. a joy unknown to me in all my prior years, a joy that does not hunger for more and more, but rests satisfied. In this time, right now, that is an enormous thing.
Mm.
I sent this, by the way, to Bill when we were trying to decide if we were going to have a child. Thank you, Paul.
That's a heavy thing to lay on.
Yeah.
As if he had a choice after that.
Yeah. But, apart from the child, the thing that really stands out in this passage to me is the talk about a sated joy, right? Because, Paul, to that point in his life, and so many of us when we're that age, it's all about the future. It's all about building your skills, building your network, building, your sense of vocation, your growing sense of competence at what you're doing, a growing sense of mastery. And there's a joy in that. There's a pride and a simple sense of accomplishment and a joy. You can look at your parents and say, look, it was worth it.
Yeah.
But what struck me here is that this kind of joy was unknown in all his prior years. A joy that does not hunger for more and more, but rests satisfied.
It's also about ambition, that younger people, as he did for so many years, was ambitious. Mm-hmm. And what this is about is you don't have to be ambitious anymore. You can be who you are there and set aside all the ambition that has driven him for years and years and years. Yeah. It's a moment of rest.
Absolutely. And he talks about that, he talks about the asymptotic curve, right? Mm-hmm. So the curve that's rising steeply, but then the passage of time asymptotes and it kind of flattens out. And it's not that you're moving to a new place with each passage of time, but you're kind of flattening out and you're there. And exactly what you said, Catherine, that you're there. The ambition is not so much of a driving. The imagining of the future is not so much of a driving, but the joy, the contentment that's there now is enough.
And for him, he came to that moment so young.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas those of us who are not quite so young may be approaching those moments and appreciating them in a very deep way. But my daughter isn't there yet. So it's for him, the time sequence of his life got foreshortened so much that he kind of jumped over all those middle years.
Yeah, he did. And, I found myself at age 67 still aspiring to this goal. I'm an institute director at Stanford and, I'm still in the hurly-burly of it. Now during the COVID emergency, probably in some ways more than ever. And I'd kind of like to get to this spot. I don't know if I ever will, but I'd kind of like to get to this spot at some point.
But didn't he also say, Bill, at one point, I'm not sure it's in this book, but I think it is, that what is life without striving? That there's something about that all of life is working towards, growing and learning and doing, and yet over different points in your life, that has a very different meaning to you. And you're right, as you retire from some things and do others, you continue to grow and to find a way to, I guess, strive, but it's a very different sense. So it's a real duopoly to me. That's not the right word, but it's a real conundrum then to try to balance those two things so that you do continue to live until you really are dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. So,
but it's different. I'm no longer interested. I'm not particularly interested in climbing a corporate ladder. I'm not particularly interested in doing one more thing just to kind of get to one more rung.
Yeah.
But you do turn, I think, more to relationships, to building meaning of life in a different way.
Well, that's what we should talk about, right? That is, this is the subtitle of the book, and I think this is a totally appropriate Lenten theme. What makes life worth living in the face of death? And that's exactly what you were just talking about. And I think, Matt, forgive me because I'm a Baptist, not Episcopalian, so I didn't grow up with Lent, and I may be misinterpreting Lent. But this seems like at least an Easter theme, right?
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure about Lent, but this is, I invite us all to continue the discussion here in the face of this question, which is the question that Paul really put in front of us, from his own personal experience with his patients and then with himself in the face of death and his family. And so right now we can just go free form. We've got time left, according to the clock, 45 minutes or 42 minutes. And I'm just interested in, we can go back to any of those quotes in the book that I have here, or we can discuss any of the others that struck you guys or any of the themes.
It was fun. It was interesting. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just frozen on the screen.
Yeah, we're frozen on the screen, but we hear you just fine.
Good. I like that hand expression.
Yeah, it's typical of me waving my hands around. Yeah.
I had picked a book for Lent and then decided that maybe it wasn't a great book and wasn't good writing and
what?
No.
No, not this book. Not this book.
Oh, another one. Okay.
Yeah, a previous book, and then I said it's not good enough. It's not going to work. And then what can we do? And someone suggested this, and I read some quotes by it, and I said, "That's beautiful. What a beautiful quote." And I wasn't sure. It seemed like a non-religious book, but it was about death. So death's a big theme, the big theme in our lives, if you will, that causes us to wonder about what is beyond us and what is beyond death. Anyway, it was a wonderful discovery to read it and to see the Christian themes come out. And whether he was speaking specifically about Christianity or about God, just the whole journey is a spiritual journey, a brave spiritual journey. So it is a perfect Lenten book. When we start with Ash Wednesday and immortality and mortality, it's an amazing book that causes us to think about our own lives and our own values and what's most important to us. And that really is what Lent is about. And hopefully in a spiritual sense, leading us to the importance of the presence of God. So
one of the themes that I thought was fun to read about was his own life and his family in particular. I thought that was quite enjoyably done, and he's such a good writer. I mean, my favorite story is the morning in their Arizona home when they open the door and there's a giant rattlesnake sleeping at the doorway. And the two boys managed to get him into a pillowcase and throw him out into the wilderness and come back and get the pillowcase later. I mean, a great story. Very, lots of fun.
Yeah, he's a gifted storyteller, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of humor in the book as well. And that's one thing I felt like I was telling Bree last night as we were going over this presentation together, that's one thing that was not captured in my presentation was his wicked sense of humor. Mm-hmm. And I actually, I have some, my screen's totally frozen. I can't go forward or back, but there were a couple of things in there that I thought were that I had as real humor. I remember one of them about how the fatal illness, it's useless to think about the future. He was saying, 5 years ago, 5 years from now, I might be alive, I might be dead. I might be this, I might be the other. So it makes it useless to think about the future. For example, beyond lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right. And I was, then there was another one he had that I can't remember right now. And I can't go.
I think it's I think people who are self-aware, it's hard not to at least appreciate, if not create humor.
Yeah.
If you're self-aware and open, it's natural, I think, to see the irony and the humor of life, if you will.
Yeah.
You know,
I see David Kennedy's picture here. Are you out there, David?
he might be muted. I don't.
Uh,
Let me see. Oh,
Let me unmute.
Oops. Hi, David.
oh,
hey, David.
yeah. Oh, Graham's here as well, and Tita and Ann. So I didn't see
Thought
that.
I'd stay on mute so the neighborhood noise didn't overwhelm this.
Gotcha.
Mm.
Well,
Bill-
I,
Things that I found sort of interesting, and particularly with that last quote that you brought up there, Bill, was somewhat similar to the another book the men's group has read, was the Gilead, where
Oh,
there
yeah.
was a pastor that was nearing death, and he had a young child, young son, not as young as Paul's, but probably early teenager, and he was reflecting on many of the same things. So it's sort of a universal theme for humans to think about this.
Yeah.
well, one of the things that Bree and I were talking about last night is that, I told Bree, I said, this has the danger of getting to this question, what makes life worth living in the face of death, and being a little, motherhood and apple pie. Of course of course it's family. No one ever sat on their deathbed and wished for another day at the office, right? But it's interesting that Bree pointed out to me, I didn't have this realization instantly myself, but she pointed out to me that Paul elected to go back to the OR with everything that demanded, with the intense physical and long hour, stamina sapping devotion. I mean, he elected family. He elected to have another seat at the chair of their family. But he also elected to submit himself back to the rigor of his chosen profession. So it's a mixed kind of message here. It's, two big decisions, and one decision for and about family, and one decision for and about his, I don't know whether to call it a calling or an obsession, but it was him. It was who he was, right?
Yeah.
I thought it rather interesting, even fascinating, that his colleagues did a lot for him so he could come back to the ER. They basically took over his administrative duties and all of this. At least that's what he presented.
Yeah.
It
There were a lot of people
may not have been quite that easy, but they made a lot of sacrifices, I guess you'd say, themselves.
For me, that his decision to return to work was amazing. I mean, I don't know how he could do that with what he was going through, physically and spiritually, but it was redeeming because he's so much, as you pointed out, Bill, he so much saw his work as pastoral.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was redeeming. He wasn't going back to work because it was his only identity. I think it was his passion to understand people and to be with people and to help them, really, as a surgeon and as a person. So it was more of a return to what's most meaningful, as opposed to returning to a rote mode of identity.
Yeah.
And I think he says somewhere, didn't he, that one of the reasons he went into neurosurgery was because he would be facing questions of life and death in real life rather than as a philosopher or a writer, somebody, because he was very interested in English and philosophy. But I think thought, well, I could just talk about it for the rest of my life, or I could go where it's happening.
Absolutely. That's some of the early quotes, from the book that I shared. But I'm you joined a little bit late.
Yeah, I missed that.
But you're right on the money. I mean, you've got it exactly right. And this man was a learned man. I mean, he had the English literature background. He had the history and philosophy of medicine background, and he had the MD and rigorous neurosurgery background. And all of those things meld in such a moving way in this book. I mean, I don't know if there's ever been a book written so much designed to move me with my particular set of background and
Right.
interests. So, I mean, I don't have the medicine, but the neuroscience I have, the questions about identity I have, the bent toward philosophy I have, the history I have, the religion, yeah, the Christian faith stuff I have. So, you know, it's one reason I didn't read that book for 4 years or 5 years after it was published, and why it's so emotional for me, you know, coming to grips with it again.
I treasure that emotion, Bill. Yeah. So
I value the fact that he's also so in a way as reticent as he is about his beliefs. I mean, he doesn't hit you over the head with them, and he's exploring all the time.
Yeah.
And certainly not propagandizing. You know, he's very. I think he's trying to steer this authentic path.
yeah,
And there's some emails I saw he'd exchanged with some of his fellow residents, I think, talking about earlier, before he was ever diagnosed, and really just sort of wrestling with his worldview and beliefs and so on. And somewhere in there, I don't remember the exact words, but he was talking about, I think it was probably his approach to something like "Who was Christ?" or something. And at some point he said, I just decided I'm all in. He didn't exactly say any more than that, you know, but he just decided I'm all in. And that's as subtly as he put it. He didn't expand a whole lot more.
That's a really interesting quote, and I don't remember it in the book. Did you read that in the book, or did you read it?
I think it was in some emails that some of his fellow residents were exchanging. I might have them somewhere.
Oh, wow, interesting.
That they were writing among themselves. And I think that perhaps the residents quoted it later on. But it was...
I think...
Sorry, this is Graham talking, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Graham, one of the things that I did when I was preparing this thing, I went back and looked at my email thread and my Colonity file, and I found emails from you. And
really?
you sent me an email from some article that it was an interview that one of your fellow residents done with Paul when he was a resident. So it was very youthful and very offhand, full of you know, off the cuff observations.
Right.
You sent that to me, and I read it again last night, literally last night. Yeah.
I'll look for it again.
So were you a resident with Paul?
No, I was an attending in the department, although I didn't work very closely with him. We had one project we were going to work on a bit together, and I liked him immensely, but we didn't work all that closely together. But he was full of energy and enthusiasm, and his fellow residents were very very loyal to him. And when he had his funeral in the chapel of the Stanford Memorial Church, that was a very moving occasion. I don't know if you're there, Bill, but that was some remarkable things said about him then.
Yes. Absolutely. So, yeah, go ahead. I mean, that funeral service was one of the most moving, services I've ever been in. It was Memorial Church was full.
Absolutely.
It was packed, which is a real testament to what he had. And I wanted to comment on one of the observations, I think it was you, Graham, made about, and maybe it was someone else, I'm sorry if I'm mistaking, about the residents, the fellow residents and the people in the Department of Neurosurgery at Stanford kind of covering for him, where he got let off of certain administrative functions and things like that, as he was trying to come back from this diagnosis. And that's very real. And that's very against the culture of surgery in general and neurosurgery in particular, right? The culture it's a very bombastic culture, a very machismo
Right.
culture, though it's changing gradually.
Yes.
And for that community of people to pull together around him like that was a real act of, a collective act of grace,
Yes.
that made Paul's journey easier. And you don't expect that in secular neurosurgery context.
It's interesting to hear Graham talk about that email where he says, I'm all in terms of his Christian faith, because as I was reading the book, I was trying to see where he was and use the term reticent, Graham, and that's certainly true. He's very, very careful about speaking directly about his faith, although it comes up again and again and it permeates the book. But in a sense, it's almost like coming, in that world of not only Stanford, but neurosurgery. It's almost, he has this humility, I'm guessing, and perhaps a kindness where he is just open to other people and not wanting to evangelize, if you will.
Yeah.
Respecting other people, giving them regard, but at the same time holding on to what's important to his own soul.
I mean, his viewpoint is, it's almost countercultural, right? That his outlook and his values can appear to be countercultural to the dominant culture inside a surgery department, and especially a neurosurgery department. And he managed to negotiate that. A lot of his references are indirect, like you don't learn that his parents were religious until somewhere 2/3 of the way through the book, they're in church. His parents and he were sitting in the pew in church one Sunday.
Right, and that there's a pastor.
Never hear to that, Yeah. It's like he felt he needed to be careful a little bit.
Well,
But, that also strikes me though, Madam, it's one of the things that, I struggle with a lot when I have a lot of friends in different parts of the country, and some of them are, I would say, kind of preachy. They don't hesitate to be very preachy about certain things, and it makes me a little uncomfortable because I can never figure out whether I'm not being open enough about my faith, or and maybe I should do more of that. But it always strikes me that, particularly in the example of Paul, is that he is living his faith. He's not preaching it, he's living it. And what a powerful example that is to everyone, which, if you're just preaching it, it's that kind of one thing, but to live it the way he does is just extraordinary, I think.
Yeah. But you bring up a wonderful theme, though, and that is, when do we speak about our faith as faith? And how do we do that in a world that's at least media presentation is saturated with stereotypical Christian being a negative thing. So I think it's something we really, it's good for us to wrestle with and to find ways like he has to claim the importance of that, of faith.
I think part of what he was living was that he had a lot of vitality. I mean, he was passionate about his work. He did these 36-hour shifts and more, and he describes the kind of pace, and he was in the thick of that. He wasn't a shrinking violet, and he wasn't just a gentle soul. I mean, he was his sense of humor, dressing up in gorilla suits and doing crazy things. He was just full of life, and that was very appealing, I think.
Nice, yeah.
I just, after reading this book, I had such an incredible sense of sadness that we lost somebody like this, who had such apparent talent and such a gift. And I guess it's the saving grace is that he left this book.
Yeah.
Because these are people you just really, we need every last one of them around.
Yeah.
And it made me very grateful that he was able to write, and he was such a good writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're saying that reminds me of the other humorous quote from the book that I
Oh
had
yeah,
written
right.
down.
Now I remember too.
You know, he was corresponding with some friend of his. He says, the good news is that I've outlived 2 Brontes, Keats,
Yeah.
Keats,
Right.
Stephen Crane. He's outlived Stephen Crane.
Those
He
are-
says, the bad news is I haven't written anything.
Yeah, that was good.
That's Paul.
That was good.
So I don't know, I think it would be really interesting if you all are willing. I don't know if you're willing. We were talking a while ago about what makes life worth living in the face of death. And we were talking about, ambition and striving and preparation and potential dominating, I don't know, the first 30, 40 years of life. And then, this kind of thing, asymptoting and being, satisfied, the sated joy of the moment. And I don't know, we're at different life stages, not radically different. We don't have any teenagers or 20-agers among us. But I'm just interested in how everybody would answer this question at your particular stage of life. And, what makes life most worth living right now in this moment for the people around this. I started to say the people around the table, but I guess it's around this server.
Around the Zoom screen.
Yeah.
Any thoughts or feelings about that question?
I think it's one that I have been wrestling with for I think a couple of years now. When I was a professor at UCLA I was there about 36 years. I've been a professor for over 40 years, and when I retired from full-time teaching, I still do some executive ed work, but I retired from full-time teaching. I was still doing a lot of my own consulting work and very busy with that, and have been deciding when is it time to slow down. And after almost, I think, in fact, getting myself into the hospital at one time last year and realizing that, I thought I was having a heart attack, but I think it was just a serious case of being unable to say no to too many projects and too many things.
That's familiar.
I'm familiar with that diagnosis.
Yeah, and you start to think in a retirement sense of when you do let go of those roles that are so typical for you, what is it? And you look forward to, people in nursing homes who are sitting with really nothing to do except waiting for the end to come. So I've been wrestling with that of what does really matter to me in this moment, and how do I want to organize hopefully my last third or last fourth of life. And some of the things I've come up with, I think, really have to do with trying to still find a way to make a difference for other people. And if I look back on teaching experience, there are days that when you go into teaching, you think, what the hell am I doing here? And I used to think, it's my job really just teach one more MBA student how to make another buck. And I came to decide while I was still teaching it, and what really changed my view of it was that someone that I knew, a colleague of mine, said, you don't do anything really important, you just change how people think. And I took that very seriously, so that it became, how would I want someone to run a company? How would I want someone to think about? How would I want them to be the best that they could be in that position? And that turned my whole life around at the time. And some of the most satisfying moments, of course, as a teacher, which Bill probably sees this as well, is when you really feel you have made that connection, you have really changed somebody's life. And so I continue to try to figure out those ways in which I can do that. I don't know how long, you know, none of us knows when he says what makes life worth living in the face of death. And we're all really, you know, it could be, even if you're 20 or 25, you have no idea how long you have.
Yeah.
So that is something that I've been wrestling with for quite a while, to try to get this next stage to be a very satisfying one if I can.
Nice.
Yeah, that's like almost oracular.
You know, I think you'd get up every day and try to do it. I mean, that's the only thing I can think is every day it's a challenge to try to find that.
That's one.
I think I'm in a similar situation in transition from the full-time, full energy, full ambition career of trying to make the program I'm in as good as it can be, to make it famous, to make it successful, to bring in money. All of that is very ambitious until you get to a point where something happens in your values, in my values, where those things matter less.
Right.
So then the question is, so what's going to matter now? What's going to matter after I'm not doing that work anymore, which is going to happen pretty soon here. And so then I fall back on sort of the three pillars of the program I'm working on, which is purpose, community, and wellness. So you're talking about purpose. What gives you purpose? And same with Paul. What gave him purpose every day? And for a while, it was going back to the OR. So if I'm not doing what I've been doing, because I really actually don't want to keep doing what I've been doing, you know, to be honest, I'm done with that. So then what's the new thing that's going to provide that same strong sense of purpose and community, like joining St. Mark's, having a set of people who share my values and who read books together and do other things together and come to church together. So that's an important thing for me. And then the wellness is sort of what you're supposed to do all the time anyway. But it's the purpose part that is that I'm in transition with. I know some things I'm not interested in doing, but I haven't quite identified the positive affirmative thing that says, okay, this is what I'm doing now. Maybe it's only for a few years, maybe it's for 10 or 15, but what is the thing that is right now giving me purpose? And that's my challenge. That's my quest for right now.
That's really great.
Yeah.
That's really great. Matt, are you taking notes here? There's future sermon material here.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. Exactly.
You got those answers?
I've been thinking, I started working on my Easter sermon today, and I'm talking about the fact that my youngest Larkin, in being sequestered and bored, she's decided to review all the old family Super 8 films of the and she's the youngest by far, and it's ironic because she's not in much of the film. being the third child a few years later, she finally discovered a film that she was actually in. But anyway, long story short, she found a video that Leanne took of my mother doing a Lenten series at St. Mark's presentation in 1997.
Your mother?
My mother.
Wow.
We were reading a C.S. Lewis book, and people were taking turns presenting and telling personal stories that reflected the themes of the book. And she talked about my brother dying of AIDS 5 years previous to the day.
Wow.
But anyway, I realized what an amazing person she was in terms of her relationships and her ability to love. So it was this incredible gift. I'd forgotten completely about the Lenten series and the presentation.
Wow.
But there's all these snippets in the movies about the past and the family that one completely forgets about. You know that you love your family and you have these memories, but to have them come back and when you've forgotten them, and to see the poignancy and hear, for example, my mother talk about her faith and the afterlife. It was
Wow.
it was an incredible gift.
Mm.
So I think that's just a way of answering your question, Bill. That we come full circle, and we remember how can we remember what was most important growing up, and what formed us, and what relationships formed our souls, and then how do we hold on to that and create relationships in these transitions that are just as meaningful, and that will plant seeds for other people, like you were saying, Carol.
Yep.
So
Thank you for that,
It's
Matt.
sort of a different way of improving your relationship with God,
yeah,
and it becomes a different way of trying to live that in a way that maybe when you were younger and you didn't have quite so much time, or you hadn't really thought of it, or the perspective didn't hit you. But there's a way of trying to live that version of love, and to therefore get yourself closer to that same being, you know, of being closer to the spirit.
yeah.
And so it's very practical and it's very spiritual all at the same time. It's a very interesting time of my life, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So Matt, did recovering that video have a big impact on Larkin, or was she just kind of dropping this grenade in your emotional life and completely oblivious to it?
No, she wasn't oblivious, and I think part of this is a journey for her,
Huh.
getting to know the family and things that she didn't live through.
Mhm.
In fact, she called me into the room when she found that,
Wow.
and
Wow. So she knew.
Yeah.
yeah, and I completely forgot about it.
Wow.
So in a sense, she's reliving the life of the family when she wasn't here.
Mhm.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
it's fascinating.
It's absolutely fascinating. She senses that continuity across time.
Yeah.
That's one of the things neuroscientists think about all the time, because the little signaling events inside the nervous system are action potentials from cells that last a millisecond. And somehow those millisecond events get stitched into things that go decades and form our identities and things. And how you cross time scales like that is just a profound problem at the depths of neurobiology, actually.
We might have to talk about that more before Easter, because that's what I'm trying to get at in my Easter sermon, is this moment of resurrection that affects the world. You know.
That's you know, there's a lot of fruit there for discussion. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what about David or Graham or Bree here that we haven't heard from yet?
Well, I retired 6 months ago from Stanford, and also in the last, just before that, I had a diagnosis of myeloma. So you know, one hopes that the treatment's a lot better than it used to be, but it does raise the question a bit more acutely of what to do with the time that we have, and particularly when we don't have the, you know, the structure of work and sometimes the immersion in work. I think Freud has said to have, somebody has said to have asked Freud once, what should somebody be able to do well in life? And he said, Lieben und arbeiten, to love and to work. And I think some of us got so wrapped up in work, we forgot about the love part. And that's one sort of rebalancing that I think I'm thinking about. How come I didn't pay more attention in the last many decades, and worked so much and was really so focused on that? And you know, fortunately, if we have time to rebalance or to make up for lost time in some of those areas, that's something that interests me. And it, you know, it's a bit daunting, I think, to think of it that way. But I have a friend who's a bit older than me who likes to say, do what you can with what you have in the present moment. if it seems overambitious or daunting, just do what you can with what you have. And a lot of it is present moments, I think. Like you just were saying, there's these little milliseconds or a few seconds or passing things, sometimes even things we don't realize, I think, that we don't realize the impact we're having on other people, just as they may not realize the impact they had on us.
Yep,
And,
absolutely.
I'm sure Paul didn't know a lot of that. And it's, I think, also an incentive to be thinking, well, what can we do to pass things on? I mean, that's what teachers do, I suppose, all their lives, but particularly when you're doing succession planning, when you're doing, or when you're thinking about how to unload the best of what you have and put it in other people's brains and minds and visions. So that's very meaningful, I think, to see young people pick something up and run with it, and to think now is not a time when we have to be possessive about the stuff. We should distribute it as readily as possible. So I hope that other people will pick it up and run with it. And that can be one satisfying thing to do with it. Otherwise, it's tempting to say, well, what was the point of all that work? But if you can pass on the bits of it anyway, that's part of it. But sometimes I think we remember people more for who they were than what they did. So maybe that'll apply to all of us.
And so
I think it's easy sometimes in the society we live in to set very high standards for what we ought to achieve. And if we don't achieve those things, we become kind of paralyzed. But to me, the things that make life worth living in the face of death are those little moments of connection, those little moments of, just a little tiny push from each of us to bring God's kingdom into being in this life. And I see that all over the place. I mean, seeing Carol on the screen, I think about the email exchanges we had about, being mothers of small children, kind of improbably. And I so treasured those email exchanges. And it would be easy to just, kind of say, what was that? A few emails, but they really mattered. Similarly, we had dinner with Paul and Lucy and Katie and some other friends. Those Paul was only alive for 8 months of Katie's life. So those were his last 8 months. And I still remember sitting at dinner with him and with Lucy and just talking about parenthood and, just, and it wasn't deep and meaningful. Like, it wasn't, he wasn't choosing the words the way he chose them in his book, but the connection, being around that table together was still every bit as meaningful. And I guess I think sometimes, it's better to do the little things when we think of them than to hold ourselves up for the great things that we might be remembered for.
Amen.
Now, Bree and I have a lot. We have to live a long time because we do have kids that still need us. So we have to keep going.
That's true.
Although my daughter's 29, she shouldn't really need me all that much, but I still try to make myself useful.
Yeah. Oh, she does need you. My daughter's 38. She calls me every day. Well, we have a granddaughter, so we get the latest videos now from Fremont, the latest pictures in the park and the new words and broccoli and hello. Yep.
Nice.
So cute.
David, what are your thoughts on this theme?
Well, obviously we're touching on a number of different topics, and some I was sort of thinking of, from my viewpoint, and others a little bit broader viewpoint, but being retired essentially at this point, you sort of say, well, there's probably a different purpose now, which for me, I think revolves more around family, and carrying on or working on the continuity of people and family values and things like that. Before, it was a lot more tied up with work, obviously. And so I sort of see purpose shifts as you go through life. And obviously, when you're young and not very aware of the world, your purpose is probably to get through the next classes in high school and then on to college and in an area you think will be useful or will be interesting in the future. And then when you're working, you're either trying to solve problems for your clients or guide the team and help them. And at some point when you say, well, purpose is sort of pre-retirement, early retirement, part of the purpose in my mind is to help the organization transition. And then you have to be sort of sensitive to when you're helping and when you're viewed as being sort of in the way because they want to do it themselves, and be able to move on to something else. But I found this book really quite interesting. And Paul was in a situation where he wasn't quite sure, but it was pretty obvious that death was becoming more and more imminent for him. A number of comments this evening, we really don't know when that's going to happen. Some people it's early, some people it's quite late. Some of you know my mother lived 102 and had a pretty fascinating life until the last year when she really didn't do much. But we all go through different passages.
Yeah. I think in the end, I think it's about relationships, wherever we are. How can we have meaningful relationships with people? Even at work, with colleagues. How can we connect and care and show caring and be anti cultural in that sense of not being afraid to say something kind or say something helpful or reach out in that way, to be faithful, if you will.
Well, for as much time as many of us spend at work, it has to be at work as well as other
Yeah.
parts of our lives.
Right.
I was gonna say especially at work.
Yes.
And what I've tried to have my students understand is that that's another opportunity to make those connections. That's a place where it's important to bring your whole self, your authentic self, to work. And as a manager, you have to do that. You have to make that connection with people because it's the only way people find any kind of joy in a major part of their life.
That's a pretty amazing statement because I spent a good part of my afternoon this afternoon trying to deal with a young faculty member who has no clue about creating meaningful relationships.
Nope.
Within the lab.
Wow.
And what makes people tick and what motivates people to
Don't give up hope because the person may figure it out maybe 10 or 20 years from now, but
Oof. Yeah.
it's a tough case, I'll tell you.
It's an investment.
I so much appreciate the words of all of you here. I mean, one thing thinking about community and what Matt was just saying about relationships and what Paul had to say about relationships, is how do you maintain relationships in the age of COVID or in the months of COVID?
Yeah.
And I think, tonight has been a pretty good example of how that's possible. I mean, Zoom is an imperfect medium. My screen has been frozen here for the last 25 minutes.
Yeah.
And yet your voices are clear and strong.
Yeah.
And I'm just glad the screen didn't freeze a half hour before that. Because then I would have. But the way.
Say that you, Bill and Bree, are sort of boring because you haven't done anything.
I want to thank Bill for taking the time to prepare this and to share it. And I agree 100% that this has been a wonderful conversation and a connection in new ways for all of us. So I'm glad all of you were here. Bertita and Graham and Ann and everybody. Thank you for being here. And
I wanted to say, Matt, I've heard so many people, and they're not on the conversation, but I've heard from several people when we were still going to church talking about this book and finding it a really great thing to have suggested to them to read, and they've really enjoyed it. So thank you for that, and to Bill for doing it.
amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. So we have Palm Sunday this Sunday, and then
Wow.
that's the beginning of Holy Week. And so we just sent out in the light tonight of various ways to connect and do our Holy Week together virtually. So I'm excited about it, and I hope you can join us for that.
It'll be a very different one this year.
And
Yeah.
Bertita says on the chat, yes, Bill and Bree, thank you so much.
Oh, nice.
So
Yeah.
Mostly Bill.
Yeah.
and thank God for videos like Frozen.
Frozen 2.
No.
It has worked. It has accomplished its intended purpose.
Yeah.
Yes.
For Noel and Graham. There's a line. What's the song they sing, Brie, in Frozen 2? Because it was just almost what Graham said. Or
Into the unknown.
no, there's one about do the next.
Oh,
Do the
next right thing.
Yeah, do the next right thing.
Yeah.
So I would let's end with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
No.
And all you.
Help us, God, in these trying times to know that we're loved, to know that we're not alone, to know that you are with us and within us and calling us to do the next right thing and the next good thing. In the name of your love, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you all.
Thank Matt.
Thank you.
I'm gonna.
Thanks to Bill and Bree.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much
Yeah,
for
being
making
here.
this a memorable evening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, and I'm gonna do evening prayer in 10 minutes. So blessings.
All right. Matt, are you going
Thanks.
to?
Thanks again, Bill.
Okay. You're
Bye.
welcome.
Okay.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.